Good afternoon. Welcome to the Library Television Network. I'm Chris Hamilton with the West Virginia Coal Association, and I'll be serving as your host here over the next half hour for this edition of the Coal Scene. Joining me in the studio is Mr. Jason Bostic. Jason is the Vice President of the West Virginia Coal Association, and Jason heads up all regulatory, technical, and environmental issues. He's joining me here today to talk about the most recent legislative session that just concluded a week or so ago, and some of the highlights of the session we'll be analyzing, along with Jason's perspective on the session, some of the issues important to the coal industry that were recently enacted into statutory law, as well as some of the other things that are going on within the industry today. Jason, good afternoon.
Afternoon, Chris.
Welcome. Appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to join us here today. Legislative session just concluded, and before the session got started, actually, just rolling back a couple months ago, we had our new Senate President, Bill Cole, and we had our House Speaker, Tim Armstead, on the program, and at that point in time, the session hadn't started, but they were just kind of getting prepared. They were organizing their resources. It was a very historic time, and I think there was a lot of high expectation that was reigning throughout the state and amongst those of us that spent a little time at the Capitol. Given all that, then fast forward to today, we just completed the 60-day session. What's some of your initial thoughts on how the session went?
Well, just from a general perspective, Chris, I think it was a historic session. It was one of the only ones in my memory where the legislative body started doing substantive work on the first day of the session. I was going over some statistics before we came down here, and the first major piece of legislation, I think, to pass both houses, passed in 10 days, the first 10 days, and it related to the repeal of the state's renewable energy portfolio. So that was one of the things that impressed me the most was, when we showed up on the first day, those guys were ready to go to work and do some heavy lifting, whereas that hasn't necessarily been the case in sessions past.
Well, we'll get into, I appreciate that, and we'll get into some of the specific legislative initiatives that passed. But I think it's also worth noting that this current legislative leadership, with Senate President Bill Cole, House Speaker Tim Armstead, at the controls, it seems like they really want to do what's necessary to move the state forward. They want to do what they can to help all of the state's businesses and industries, and it seems like they have singled out the coal industry because of some of the problems it's experiencing, some of the downward trends that are having severe negative financial consequences to the state, and wanted to see what they could do to aid the industry.
Yes, I would agree with that, Chris. And I think the first evidence of that would be the fact that on both sides, the Senate and the House, that the energy committees of their respective chambers were elevated to major committee status by the new leadership. So I think that expressed their intent to deal seriously with matters of state energy policy. But I think, Chris, if you'll look, specifically at some of the environmental issues that the legislature tackled this year, it was in line with this theme, or with this key motivation, that we have to get West Virginia coal competitive again. And we have, as you know, a set of standards and regulations, whether it's environmental or health and safety, that are West Virginia specific. And in a market, the coal market we find ourselves in, which is compressed because of EPA clean air rules or EPA air quality rules, and a market that's compressed because of federal interruption to the permitting process, then every single cent on a price of coal counts on whether or not you win or lose a contract. And I think the legislature took a really hard look at some of those regulations and standards that are in place here that only exist here, in an effort to try to determine, why are they here? Do we really need them 20, 30, 15 years after they were enacted?
You mentioned the repeal of the alternative renewable energy portfolio, and there was a lot of question, a lot of debate over, how much future coal would actually be impacted by that. And I think as that act was to be phased in, the first segment, the second segment, the third, more and more, or a higher percentage of non-coal would have to be infused into the overall energy pie to meet those standards. And wow, I think the utilities indicated that they wouldn't have much difficulty in meeting that standard today. But down the road, when you got to remove 20-25%, as this act provided for, I'm not sure there was really any other way of getting there but to burn less coal in the state.
I think you're exactly right, Chris. The first few phases of that portfolio were relatively harmless. But as time marches on and the other deadlines kick in, it became really apparent that coal-fired generation would face cuts under that portfolio standard. And one of the things I think that was lost in a lot of the press and a lot of the hyperbole surrounding the repeal of the energy portfolio is because of some of the particulars of the carbon dioxide rules that EPA is currently promulgating or revising, that states that had a renewable portfolio like West Virginia, it would have been easier for the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to come in and force a plan on a state to take deeper emission cuts from coal-fired and fossil fuel-fired generation to comply with some future set carbon dioxide rule. I think that was lost on a lot of folks. That was a very important piece of that debate.
So in other words, if looking forward, and once the EPA, the current EPA proposed rules on climate change, once those once those took effect, then there's a scenario where EPA could have had some control or responsibility over the administration of our renewable portfolio.
That's exactly right. There's a law that was passed, the renewable portfolio, a law that was passed several years ago, I think contemplating state-only control of how that portfolio was interpreted and implemented, suddenly became a tool, if you will, or a weapon that could have been used by the federal government through its own interpretation of what that standard meant.
Thinking for a moment about the proposed climate rules that are of a major concern throughout not only the coal industry but other industries and other businesses that rely on low-cost industrial fuel supplies. I understand that there was another piece of legislation that would subject the state's implementation plan to legislative review and approval.
Yes, sir.
And
House Bill 2004 is, again, a very, very early piece of legislation the legislature tackled in the initial weeks of the session, as you know. And it basically set the stage, going back to how the Clean Air Act is structured. For Clean Air Act standards for existing sources of discharge, like the coal-fired power plants that we currently have in the state of West Virginia, the Clean Air Act imposes a duty on states, once EPA writes a regulation or writes a standard, for states to come up with what are called state implementation plans, or SIPs. And those state implementation plans are reviewed and or approved or modified by EPA. So that's typically how Clean Air Act regulation works. What's different with respect to the carbon rules in this particular instance would be the fact that EPA's proposal to reduce carbon emissions from existing power plants went way beyond the traditional boundaries of what a power plant emission control system would be. EPA has gone as far as to suggest restructuring the electrical grid of a particular state, including West Virginia, so that the dispatch mode, the power plants that are put on the grid first, are altered not by the cost of the megawatt per hour, but by the carbon source. So that instead of dispatching low-cost coal plants first, you may dispatch higher-cost other sources first because they're lower in carbon emissions. And I think what the legislature looked at was the fact that that goes beyond traditional environmental regulation. That goes into consumer protection and the Public Service Commission's role to control costs for the consumer for things like electricity. So I think the legislature thought it was important that they have the final say in what a state implementation plan would look like, because again, it goes beyond environmental regulation and what the Department of Environmental Protection would normally come up with under the Clean Air Act. it affects other things like market control of the electrical grid.
You know, Governor Tomlin and DEP Secretary Randy Huffman, you know, work very close with the coal and energy industries and the utility sector, and they're very much concerned, as we are, with the future implementation of these rules. And, you know, we feel very comfortable with Governor Tomlin being at the controls and Secretary Huffman when, and his staff when this state plan is formulated and eventually implemented. You know, but Governor Tomlin only has less than 2 years left, you know, as governor, and you know these air quality rules have a tendency of being litigated, maybe dragging on before they're finalized. So I think that also provides a little bit of a safeguard, not knowing you know who will be sitting in the mansion, or for that matter over at DEP. So and it's a major decision. You know, it's a major policy decision for the state of West Virginia to make that'll be evident through that plan.
It absolutely is, Chris. I mean, again, because of EPA's push to go outside of the traditional regulation of pollutants at a power plant to market decisions and how power plants are dispatched and how they're maintained, I think having the added perspective of the legislature to bring in things about consumer protection, those on fixed incomes, and its ability of the EPA's Clean Power Plan to impact consumer rates. I think it was good to expand that beyond just DEP's perspective. You need other perspectives in a plan so massive and so wide sweeping as what that could be.
As I understand the regulatory proposal from EPA, President Obama's climate rules, there's two distinct proposals. One deals with new coal-fired generators, and that's the rule that basically prohibits, from a cost standpoint, the design and construction of a new coal-fired generator. The second rule is the one that requires the state implementation plan, and that deals with our existing fleet of coal-fired units.
Yes, sir. And EPA for the existing generators proposed a set of steps that you can employ or deploy at these coal-fired power plants to reduce your carbon emissions. Some of which, or most of which, the industry and the electric utility industry have looked at and deemed impractical or just not possible, like increasing efficiency at existing coal-fired power plants. Most of the power plants that are going to survive the mercury regulation that's currently before us right now and having a real impact on coal consumption will be the most efficient, cleanest scrubbed power plants in the country. So trying to squeeze 1 or 2 or 3, I think EPA's assumption was 6% higher efficiency out of those plants is probably a pipe dream. The other thing EPA talks about again is the redispatch of lower carbon sources of power over coal-fired power plants, so that nuclear power, natural gas, or alternatives dispatch first. Now that's a fundamental reshaping of this nation's electrical grid. You know, before EPA's proposal, power was dispatched based on cost. So the lowest cost sources of energy dispatched first, which typically has meant coal-fired power plants. But EPA is basically going to take the model that has worked since the days of Edison and turn it on its head. So the lower carbon footprint electricity source would dispatch first, regardless of cost.
You know, the climate rules, which are of major concern, they're only proposed today. There are a number of other requirements on coal-fired generators that have been imposed, if you will, over the past couple of years, that's resulting in a lot of the issues, a lot of the problems and lower coal burn that we're experiencing today. I'm not sure people really understand, you know, the range or the full scale of regulatory requirements that have been imposed on our coal-fired generating systems over the past 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Chris. Starting with the initial passage of the Clean Air Act in the late 80s and early 90s, the emissions at coal-fired power plants have been reduced in an incremental way over the last number of years, but it was always the previous iterations of the Clean Air Act were always rational, if you will, in their approach to reduce emissions from coal-fired power plants. And for example, electric utilities could build state-of-the-art cleaner plants to reduce emissions and get credits for traditional emissions standards like sulfur dioxide and apply those to older plants that just because of their age or because of where they were built couldn't have new technology applied to those. But again, an across-the-board reduction in emissions from power plants has occurred in this country, and I think we've reduced emissions somewhere around the order of 75 to 85%.
I actually think it's been a little higher. I mean, it might be closer to
It might be closer to 90.
90. I mean, I see 90% reduction, and the thing about that is, I mean, and that has come, you know, across the whole range of particulates. You know, as you indicated, we've removed substantial percentages of sulfur, particulate matter, ground level ozone. It's, you know, it's been ratcheted down to almost a nil zero emission. You know, what people see coming out of the John Amos plant and other coal-fired units is basically water vapor and steam today. It's not, you know, it's not the traditional smoke.
That's right. And Chris, to use the most recent example, I mentioned it earlier, is the mercury control regulation. Until EPA proposed its carbon dioxide control rules, that was the most expensive regulation ever proposed in American history. To reduce less than 1% of mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants, this nation will spend in the order of $10 to $15 billion to comply with that rule. And unfortunately, what it really means in terms of impacts are the closure of otherwise efficient and environmentally safe coal-fired power plants. We're getting ready to go through a round of that here in West Virginia right now, when AEP will close 3 power plants because of the mercury control regulation.
AEP will close 3. I believe First Energy will close 3, and those 6 plants are account for, if I'm not mistaken, 18 individual electric generating units.
Yes, sir.
And you know, the closure or announcement of the closure of those plants is not isolated to West Virginia. I believe you know, the majority of states that rely on coal, and that's you know, that's what 46, 48 states have all announced closure of you know, 1 or more coal-fired generators.
Yeah, this is a pretty serious problem across the country. There's going to be massive reductions and wholesale retirement, again, of otherwise very efficient, very environmentally protective power plants because of EPA's mercury rule. And one of the frustrations that has been felt in Congress, felt in the coal states, and was heard by the United States Supreme Court, I think, this week, was the fact that EPA proposed this sweeping, super expensive regulation without any consideration of cost. So this $10 billion regulation, major impact to the nation's electric grid, was implemented or will be implemented by EPA with no concern for the public health or the public welfare. And I think that really came home to a lot of folks in the last 2 winters that we've gone through, when the temperatures were extremely low. And most of the generation that's scheduled to be retired under the mercury control regulation was running at peak capacity so that it could supply power to the grid because of the upswing in electrical consumption.
You know, you hear a lot today about you know, WARN notices being issued at certain mines, and we have several thousand miners that have already been furloughed over the past couple of years as we've seen you know, a decrease in our coal production. But when a power plant closes, you know, there's some economic loss. There's loss of employments, loss of communities in these areas. You know, I know you know, there's a couple additional thousand jobs that are associated with these 6 you know, coal-fired units that are going to be closing this year and through next year.
Yes, I mean, you can use the Canal River or Glasgow plant as an example. I noticed there was a picture of the plant up on the screen a minute ago, But the towns of Cedar Grove and Glasgow in the eastern part of Kanawha County are kind of centered around the operation of that plant. And the other point good point you raised, Chris, is the fact that we do have mines that are closed, and folks have been furloughed and laid off. But in most cases, the infrastructure for the mine is still in place, at least for the short term, and we can reactivate the mine if the demand picks back up. With one of these substantial coal-fired power plants, that's not going to be the case. These are big facilities. They have huge infrastructure and permitting requirements, and once they are taken offline and dismantled, they're gone forever. You can't get that generation back.
And there's a clear downstream economic trend as well. There are jobs. You'll find the 7-Eleven on the corner sustained by the 200 people that work at that, just as they work at a mining operation, at the power facility. The Pizza Hut, the McDonald's, some of the service jobs.
And the transportation of the coal, again, using the Kanawha River plant as an example, most of its coal comes by barge. So you're going to eliminate the river tow and barge operators that ferry the barges back and forth to that power plant, as an example.
I think I read where the United Mine Workers had done an economic impact statement on the president's climate rules. And I believe that number was around 75,000 jobs nationally that they have assessed that would be lost due to the implementation of the EPA's climate rules. And I think those are spread across predominantly coal mining, but they're also electric utility, they're also transportation, both barge and rail. But that's a high number, and I believe they predicted that number 10 years later, when we get into the second phase of reductions required by the president's climate rules. I think that number effectively doubles, 125, 150,000 lost jobs.
Yeah, pretty sobering numbers, Chris. And I think for the folks in Congress that have heard that testimony and that evidence from the United Mine Workers, the numbers are almost so staggering to be incomprehensible. What are you going to do with that massive reduction in the amount of jobs in this country? And what is that going to do to use the nation's transportation system as an example? The largest single commodity moved by rail today is coal. And will the railroads be able to maintain their infrastructure to move general freight, oil, other commodities if they lose the base of coal traffic that supported them for so long? Questions worth answering or worth asking, and attempt to get answers from the federal administration.
Yeah, it really is, and I think the fact that we've had a strong export product and a very viable export market over the past 4 or 5 years has isolated the state of West Virginia, or perhaps has served as somewhat of a safety net, preventing us from experience even greater coal losses, employment and job losses, but we're having some problems there now as well.
Yes, we indeed are. As you know, coal resources in what were once very isolated parts of the world are being developed. Parts of the former Soviet Union, closer to China, which is the world's largest consumer of coal, are being developed, and it's coal that somewhat mimics that of West Virginia or Central Appalachia in its qualities and in its heat generation and in its coking qualities, and it's closer to the intended market. And coal development in those countries traditionally is less regulated than it is here in this country or in this state. So it's obviously a cheaper commodity for those that need it. But our export markets, our international markets, are starting to see some of that impact, not only of new coal resources, but also just the general depressed nature of the worldwide economy when steel production has dropped so substantially.
Well, I think we've seen the growth rate in the Asian territory generally has slowed, and that's resulted in less power consumption, just as the United States has experienced here over the past 7 or 8 years now. As you go through a period of recession, you're not making what you were. You're not making much. You don't consume as much power, and I think China especially has experienced that here over the last couple of years.
Yes.
But back to the pricing models, it costs a little more to mine it here, and it certainly costs a little more to ship it from here to China and the Asian markets generally than what it does from Australia or some of the Central America places, Indonesia and Colombia.
Yes, yeah. Again, you know, the coal resources are very similar to ours, but they're typically, as Australia in particular, it's surface mining, where the majority of the mining that we do in West Virginia is underground mining, which is typically more expensive. And as you said, Chris, moving coal to market from West Virginia is kind of tough. Lack of navigable rivers, we're heavily reliant on the nation's rail system, and it is expensive to move to port to get to export, whereas some of the coal resources in Colombia, for example, are located very close to the international ports. So it's very easy to put it on a ship and move it to China or move it to India or Europe for that matter.
You know, the coal industry has been in a global market for a long time, probably as long as the industry's been around, or shortly after it came together. But so you know, it's not just what goes on domestically here, but it's international policy, it's international weather events, you know, politics, everything plays a role, it seems, you know, as it does here domestically, but globally as well. You know, the other thing, I know we had just a little bit of coal, I think I read where coal imports were on the increase, which really compounds some of our domestic issues here.
Absolutely, because we're after dropping for a number of years, coal imports have gone up in recent years. And again, this is coal that's very similar to West Virginia coal in its nature and its burning qualities. And it can be delivered substantially cheaper from Colombia to power plants in New England than we can ship it from West Virginia.
Do you see things plateauing here soon? Do you think we hit bottom, so to speak?
I'm not really sure. The closure of the power plants because of the mercury control regulation, I'm hope that we're starting to work through that, and maybe we've seen the worst of that, and that, you know, as a world, we can only not make things for so long, and it's been a long time since the steel industry globally has rebounded. So hopefully we're ready to start making things again, and maybe that'll lead to a resurgence, particularly in the export market for metallurgical coal.
Well, hopefully we can, you know, get some things moving here, and hopefully back to, you know, what brought us here today. Hopefully our legislature and Congress can enact the kind of policies and programs that'll help stimulate the industry and promote some growth. We're going to have you back on here. We're about out of time, but we'll have you back on here shortly, and maybe pick up and look a little further down the road and see what we're going to do to try to turn things around. But I want to thank you so much for taking time to come by, and want to thank you for tuning in to the library channel here this afternoon and this edition of the Coal Seam. Thank you.